Well, welcome everybody. We are here for Sara Granovetter's dissertation defense, The Asymmetrical Mirror. My name is Dr. Craig Chalquist. I'm a core faculty member in East-West Psychology here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I also have the honor to be chair of this dissertation committee. One of our members, Gabe Bradshaw, is a little bit late. We expect her to be present shortly. And then Alka, if you would just introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Alka Aurora. I'm core faculty in the Women's Spirituality program at CIS, and one of my areas of research and teaching is on vegan ecofeminism. And it's a real pleasure to be on Sara's committee.
Great. So let me give you a heads up about how it'll go, and then I'll just hand it over to Sara, and we'll hear from her on her defense. So our students have about, in this case, doctoral candidates have about 45 minutes to present. And then they'll cover the area of their research, methodology, and other parts of it. And then when the 45 minutes are over, then the committee will each have a chance to ask a couple of questions, each of us. And then once we've done that, we will confer, we'll go off the call briefly and then confer by cell phone. And good. Hey, Bradshaw, hey there. Perfect. Hi. I'm just giving everyone an overview of what we're doing today.
Right.
So after our candidate presents, the committee will ask a couple of questions each, and then if we have them, and then we will confer. The committee will call me and I'll do a conference call on my cell phone. And then while we're doing that, everybody else who's present here today is welcome to ask our candidate whatever questions they want about her work. And then once the committee confers, we will return to this Zoom call and announce our decision. So that's what we have planned. And without further ado, I will go ahead and hand things over to Sara. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig. And Gay and Alka. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. So I wanted to begin this presentation with a disclaimer. And that is that some of what I will say may bring up feelings of discomfort, as is in some way intended. This work is an invitation to look at parts of ourselves that may not often see the light. And it's not intended as a lecture in morality. I share this work as an imperfect ally to animals and speak as much to and for myself as to anyone else. And so, in terms of what drew me to this work, I want to say a little bit about that background. I've felt a combination of awe, deep connection, and tension with non-human animals for as long as I can remember. But the seeds of this dissertation were planted when I was living and working at Esalen Institute in Big Sur. During this time, I learned of some inhumane methods of pest animal management on the farm. And I felt really gripped by this visceral knowledge, kind of painfully compelled to take action, but also terrified to speak up. After hearing several gruesome stories, I eventually worked up the courage to speak to the garden manager, who was a mild-mannered woman, about the way they were killing ground squirrels on the farm. But when I opened my mouth to ask her if she had a moment to chat, no words came out. Only tears flowed down my face. I was completely paralyzed. When I did manage to get a few words out, she rose up in outrage as she realized the topic at hand. But behind her rage, I saw something wild and fearful in her eyes. I had never in my life experienced such paralysis and loss of voice, and it led me to ask some questions. Questions were, why couldn't I speak? Why was it all so scary for me? Why did I feel ashamed to stand up for animals? And what caused the explosive reaction in that otherwise mild-mannered gardener and this defensive avoidant posture? And that led me to the further question of, why did animal rights activists seem to be pariahs of all social movements? And so I really found myself in a kind of psychological minefield with a lot of powerful forces at work that seem to be both in the personal and the collective unconscious. Over time, I came to see that my response to animals was as much in service to the real animals as it was a call from the disenfranchised corners of my own psyche, unheard, unspoken, unresolved cultural complexes that resonated with the wounded psyche of the animal. This doesn't mean that the call to speak for animals was just about me, or it was actually just about my internal work. It was a coinciding call. And so this realization eventually led into more specific questions that led to my dissertation, not before I became a somatic depth psychotherapist. That came first. But before I launch into the dissertation, I just want to offer a few acknowledgements. I just wanted to acknowledge Craig, my dissertation, my committee chair. And Craig's ideas have just been an inspiration to me throughout my time in the East-West program. His course just really got me through with a lot of excitement and aliveness. And he also stepped in at the last minute when my last chair was resigned. So I just want to offer a big thanks for that. And then Alka, I wanted to thank you for stepping in completely blind as well at the last moment, not even being part of my committee, and bringing in such a discerning eye and offering feminist perspectives onto these issues. And then Gay, so much thanks to you. You've been such a steadfast mentor and provided hours of guidance and rigorous and compassionate support. And just want to thank my family, my husband Gabe and my daughter Juniper. Thank you for your endless support and patience as I've completed this project. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into the dissertation itself. So my dissertation is based on a few questions, and these questions are based on a few presuppositions. So central presuppositions of this work are: 1, there is a gap in cultural discourse, and by discourse, I mean spoken or written language in social contexts. There's a gap in cultural discourse about the unfathomable magnitude of animal suffering and death that occurs through industrial exploitation. 2, there is a corresponding gap in collective awareness about this suffering, which in many cases stems from a desire not to know that which is already known. In some ways, another way of talking about the unconscious. I, of course, don't want to overlook the fact that there are many that actually genuinely do not know what happens on factory farms, and that is due to a lot of media and industry manipulation. So these lead into my research questions. The first research question is, how does the Western human psyche digest a relationship with animals that is so present on and in our bodies as food or clothing, yet collectively omitted from the relational field and from normative discourse? And then, in what ways does the objectification, omission, and socially condoned harming of animals both arise from and contribute to deep intrapsychic conflicts? 3, how do our psyches and our bodies register the traumatic rupture in the trans-species psyche? That is, how do we hold and feel the impact of animal harm and extinction in our bodies and in our unconscious? And then finally, I ask, how can we heal collective dissociation around this topic? And how would that be healing for all species? So before I go more into the methodology, I just want to talk a little bit about delimitations, meaning how does this research limit itself? What is it not about? So in one sense, this dissertation just refers to Western industrial society, right? I do suspect that some of the findings may apply more globally, in part due to the spread of Western industrial capitalism, but I'm not in a position to make such claims. This research focuses on depth psychological perspectives, as well as contemporary trauma studies. And within the realm of psychoanalysis, I draw from object relations theorists and Lacan. And in analytical psychology, I draw from Jung and Hillman. And so it's important to say that I'm not explicitly employing all these other lenses onto these issues that are so valuable and so valid. For instance, economic lenses, political lenses. I'm not really applying too much feminist lenses. I'm not applying psychological lenses that are cognitive or behavioral. And I'm not applying philosophical lenses that are based on ethics. However, there is Alka kind of pointed out to me that there is a type of ethics called feminist care ethics, and that has to do with the normalization of emotional and empathic responses to animals as a valid basis for an ethics of care. So in that sense, it does overlap more with feminist care ethics. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the methodology of this dissertation. So because this dissertation consists of 3 articles, I'm going to briefly describe some of the overarching methodology before diving into each paper separately. I'm just going to take a pause here and have a sip of water. All right. So this dissertation is in some sense a discourse analysis. I am most interested in omissions. I'm interested in what does not get said, in gaps in discourse. But ultimately, this interest in discourse gets funneled into a psychoanalytic lens. And so the Oxford English Dictionary defines psychoanalysis as a system of psychological theory and therapy which aims to treat mental disorders by investigating the interaction of conscious and unconscious elements in the mind and bringing repressed fears and conflicts into the conscious mind. And so this is, thought that was a great definition of psychoanalysis for the purpose of this paper. It really describes what I'm doing here. And then somewhat separate from the psychoanalytic lens is the analytical lens. And analytical psychology refers to the psychology of Carl Jung, who, in contrast to Freud, who theorized that the unconscious consisted only of repressed personal experiences, viewed the deepest layer of the unconscious as a collective realm where all human and arguably non-human beings are connected to one another across culture and time through universal themes and patterns he called archetypes. Another important lens that I use here is that of archetypal psychology. And archetypal psychology refers to the psychology of James Hillman, who was a contemporary of Jung, and he decentered the human ego and the self. He privileged what he called soul, calling the ego or self just one myth among many voices. Now, in addition to these kind of depth psychological lenses, I also draw from trauma studies, namely as articulated by Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Herman, although there are other theorists that I include there. Along with, and Lacan, he's an important, he could be said to be one kind of trauma theorist. So Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Herman emphasize the relational, embodied, and transverbal, meaning beyond words, nature of trauma. Both Herman and van der Kolk emphasize the importance of relationship or lack thereof in creating and healing trauma. Herman expanded this relationship to include our relationship with our society, pointing out that repeated trauma happens within a societal context that creates the conditions for this trauma to occur. And finally, another important lens I should mention here that shows up in almost all my articles is that of transspecies psychology. And transspecies psychology is a liberatory model of psychological thought that was actually created by Gabe Bradshaw, who's with us here today, that asks psychology to recognize what other sciences already have, that humans and animals share profound commonalities in emotional and cognitive systems. And because of that, it should be recognized that the well-being of humans and animals are inextricably linked and equally important subjects of psychological care. With a deep breath, I'm going to move on to the first article. So this dissertation is comprised of 3 articles that all explore these themes from different angles. And so I'm going to take one more deep breath. And if you'd like to take a pause, I'm going to invite you to do that also before I launch in. So the first article is entitled Animal Speech and Silence, the Project of Commuting. In this theoretical paper, I use a critical hermeneutic psychoanalytic lens to argue that we cannot mute animal voices without co-muting the human soul. In particular, I suggest that in muting animals, we silence a portion of our psyche that I label the other within, which is a transverbal, disenfranchised seat of otherness within our very being. I'm going to explain more about that in a moment in case that just went right over your head. So first of all, I want to say more about what I mean by muting. And so by muting, I do not necessarily mean literal silencing, though it may mean that. Rather, I mean rendering an other an object, rendering their speech non-speech by claiming that their communication is meaningless and doesn't emanate from a sentience deep within them. For example, one way to mute animals is to say that they are harvested rather than killed, because in that case, they were never truly alive to begin with and had no response to their forced transition from life to death. On a more subtle level, we mute ourselves and we mute the other within when we cut off its capacity to communicate with us by dissociating from these other voices within us. So at this point, you might be asking, what is the other within? So I'm going to say more about that. The other within, first of all, rests on the theory of a dialogical self. And that theory says that the self is not a singularity, but a multiplicity of autonomous centers of awareness that can be brought into conscious dialogue. So the other within kind of imprecisely maps onto a number of different concepts in depth psychological literature. And two that I use here are Jung's shadow archetype and Lacan's the real. For the sake of brevity, I'm not even going to go into Lacan because that's just not going to be brief. I'm going to focus here on the shadow. So a quote from Jung in Integration of the Personality, he says, "Taken in its deepest sense, the shadow is the invisible saurian tail that man still drags behind him. Carefully amputated, it becomes the healing serpent of the mysteries. Only monkeys parade with it." So, while I take issue with a number of points there, namely the amputation of the tail, what would happen if we were to follow that tail rather than amputate it? I believe that it would show us that the other within is a connection point to the transspecies psyche, a collective dimension of the unconscious where all beings and species meet. In this case, in the entangled process of co-muting, the muting of animals parallels and perpetuates our own psychic deadening. And in this paper, I conclude that in order to unmute, we must allow ourselves to become undone as a unitary self in control of our thoughts, bodies, and emotions in the same way that we believe ourselves in control of animals. We must allow animals to lead us back to the disenfranchised portions of our souls, which means opening ourselves to the deep pain of being moved by their plights. All right. And I'm going to now move on to the next article. And this article is entitled "The Living Shadow, an Embodied Inquiry into Jung's Most Elusive Archetype." So in this article, I wanted to more deeply understand and facilitate connection with the other within through research on the shadow archetype. And so this research was actually done in the context of a course at CIIS. This course was entitled Embodied Spiritual Inquiry. The research employs embodied spiritual inquiry, which is a radical second-person research methodology developed by former professor Jorge Ferrer that uses interactive embodied meditations to gain information about various research questions. Interactive embodied meditations involve a kind of freely associative reflection about research questions in the context of giving and receiving prescribed forms of touch. And this type of touch that happens between partners is aimed at bringing awareness to different centers of the body. And this research is also a form of cooperative inquiry, which is a form of research developed by John Heron. It's a mode of research where participants are labeled co-researchers, and this research includes them, the co-researchers, in each phase of the research. In the case of this particular iteration of this research, co-researchers asked, how do interactive embodied meditations, which is the type of research methodology we used here, support an understanding of and relationship with the shadow archetype? My research then compared co-researchers' findings with canonical Jungian and post-Jungian accounts of the shadow. So while there were a variety of findings, most relevant to this research was that multiple participants believed that, in addition to consisting of disowned contents, the shadow possessed its own center of awareness. And this understanding is actually resonant with Jung's description of the shadow as the lumen naturae, which is a way of understanding the shadow as a light that emanates from within the darkness, the light of nature. He describes it as a type of awareness that faces the inside of things. And in the case of the co-researchers, they believed that the awareness that emanated from the shadow consisted of disowned, eco-feminine, and non-human animal forms of perception. So within this research then, the conclusions that I came to was that the disowned voice of non-human nature spoke powerfully through research participants, finding expression in their embodied psyches. In positing this co-sensing, I suggest that the loss of nature is felt collectively and resonates with all animate life. Its persistent voice in this research suggests that the shadow, as a trans-species whole earth process, seeks attention so that it may be integrated and healed. And it is a vital next frontier in shadow work. So that's all I will say right now about that study. And I'm going to now move on to the final article in this dissertation. And this article is entitled Activists as Symptom, Healing Trauma Within a Ruptured Collective. So you might have heard, or maybe you even have a part of you that thinks animal rights activists are way too emotional. Maybe they're just crazy. Maybe you've heard that, maybe you think that. In a way, this article is about reclaiming and owning these labels, because what I found was that many animal activists who are active in the field actually do experience mental suffering, mainly in the form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or STS, secondary stress disorder. But I maintain in this article that this craziness is actually a healing pathology, and it is a symptom of a dysfunctional system in search of healing, and actually an accurate reflection of and response to what they learn and to what they witness that others do not and will not. So, in the course of this study, I had conversations with 10 activists who described their experiences bearing witness to unspeakable suffering at slaughterhouses and on factory farms. What I found was that all activists experience symptoms of trauma, and in analyzing this trauma, I found it to be indicative of that whole system in search of healing. For example, almost all activists experience dissociation, which is a common symptom of trauma. However, this dissociation extended beyond the boundaries of activist psyches. It was actually a pervasive quality of the social industrial contexts in which activists found themselves trying to help animals. And it was echoed on factory farms where deaths are depersonalized through mechanization, distancing language, and concealment. The second powerful finding of this research was that activist trauma was compounded because it lacked empathic attunement from the culture in which activists are embedded. So activists would come back from open rescues to a bright, bustling world that's silently constellated around the unsayable and unspeakable nightmare world that activists just visited. This world's industries, rituals, foods, garments, and economy rely on the death of non-humans whose gaze these activists, many of them just profoundly shared in moments before their death. And recall here that Judith Herman emphasized how important relationship was in the healing of trauma, including our relationship with our society. If that is the case, then this misattunement and this actual absenting of activist experiences from discourse and from society is a massive relational failure that basically ends up compounding their trauma and making it difficult to heal. So conclusions from this research are that, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about theorist Karen Inouye, who believed that that which is unspoken and repressed in a society, just like what activists witness is unspoken and repressed, tends to persist across space and time. And if it is not taken up by those directly impacted, a carrier group will bring this trauma forward into the collective, willing to experience others' suffering as their own. In this case, as willing symptom bearers for the Western industrial cultural trauma, activists give expression to collective trauma within the collective cultural unconscious. The strength with which those seek to silence them only confirms the presence of wounding at the collective core. And again, in this research, what was found was that when activists were attuned to, listened to, taken seriously, when not only their spoken words was attuned to and taken seriously, but their affect, their trauma, then what is frozen in the body as trauma can melt into grief because it is shared and affirmed within a collective fabric. So that concludes my description of the 3 articles that comprise this dissertation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some directions for future research, and there are a lot of them. These are really, in some ways, very initial exploratory findings, and to validate some of these findings, future research should include more qualitative and potentially quantitative studies, perhaps employing psychoanalysis as a research method, evoking unconscious content through studying associations and microreactions to images, ideas in a controlled environment. These environments should also be diverse in their cultural, racial makeup, socioeconomic makeup, to really get a sense for the collective consciousness as a whole. In addition, it would be very important and interesting to look at gender differences in these regards. Among one of the studies that would be really important to look at psychoanalytically would be a thematic analysis of archived or elicited animal dreams, to bring more information to light about what is going on right now in the collective consciousness with respect to animals. What are the interpsychic conflicts and corrections that our psyches are trying to bring forth? And finally, actually not finally, a couple more. If this is indeed heavily defended terrain in the collective unconscious, it would suggest that certain types of animal advocacy outreach might be more effective than others. Future studies could measure the impact of different types of outreach and note if outreach that accounted for trauma and collective trauma and unconscious defenses had a significant difference in impact than outreach that did not consider these qualities. In terms of practical applications, I think that this research could point to an avenue of support for activists, animal activists, many of whom suffer from, as we saw in the previous article, PTSD and severe burnout. And this research could point to ways to help animal activists tend to places within them that seek healing alongside the animal, so that all of this impetus to heal is not projected outward, but also internalized, so that their activism can be more sustainable. And I think that's about all I have to say for now. Just a note to end here about the title, The Asymmetrical Mirror. Why is the mirror asymmetrical? The mirror is asymmetrical because we see ourselves in the eyes of the animal, right? And we also, as Derrida mentioned, see something that seems deeply other, right? But in being reflected in the eyes of the animal, in seeing ourselves in the animal, it's not just the selves we know that's reflected, but it's the self that we may experience as deeply other and alien to ourselves, the places within us that haven't seen the light. So there I will end, and thank you so much for listening and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sara. So the custom in East-West dissertation defenses is usually to ask the external reader to start us on questions. So I'd like to ask Dr. Gay Bradshaw, do you have questions for our doctoral candidate? Gay, you're muted.
Thank you, Sara. That was a beautiful presentation. And you gave us a very elegant walkthrough in a complicated subject. I have several questions, and so shut me up when I go on too far.
Okay.
I guess one thing that really interests me is from your personal perspective, you issued the disclaimer beforehand. Do you think that that's also part of the asymmetry? In other words, if we were giving some kind of a presentation on a marginalized human population, would that same kind of disclaimer be prompted?
So do you mean that it's an asymmetry between how one might start a presentation about animals and the disclaimer that I might have to make, and between how it might happen if I were to make a presentation about marginalized humans?
Mm-hmm.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I do think there's a huge asymmetry in academic context among how we talk about marginalized animals and marginalized humans, and maybe it could be seen as like a form of apologism, right, in making that kind of disclaimer. But I think that I make that disclaimer also as an acknowledgement of how kind of heavily how much shame and defendedness is kind of held in the collective around this topic, and so in making a disclaimer like that, I'm also aiming to, and maybe this is just revealing too much, aiming to find a way to soften into those defenses, to help people listen with more of a soft focus, and to help people become more receptive to the topic. I also make the disclaimer because it feels true for me, and because even if I were personally talking about marginalized human populations, and if I were not included in that population, I would also feel like I was speaking as much to myself as anyone else. So, and I think partly it's true because, I often question my allyship with animals. And so I wanted to feel inclusive, but I absolutely take your point and agree with you that there are vast asymmetries in the way we hold animals and the way we hold marginalized human others in academic contexts. Yeah.
And related to that, I'm just talking about a general pattern, and it's not specifically targeted at you. This is just an opportunity to have more of an open discussion on a changing trend. The other thing is that, you spoke about, and we've talked about this a lot in terms of, in fact, I even teach on this. In other words, self-care, self-awareness, et cetera, for people who are working in animal rights, animal activism, et cetera. and the kinds of, and your data in terms of the discourse, which I think is really important. I really appreciate your underscoring a different relationship and a demarginalization of personal stories and discourse. I think that's something that our society is really suffering from. So in other words, the notion of trauma, PTSD, blah, 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 that has been identified by and with animal activists and advocates. What about a parallel in terms of the quote unquote perpetrators or the agents of the trauma? Now, if you look from longitudinal studies in different kinds of parallel types of one group, whatever you want to call it, marginalizing is a nice word for it, another group. So we're really talking about systemic genocide and justified genocide. Do you have any thoughts about that? In other words, that the science, transspecies psychology is just a label for the bulk of science, which admits to the fact that all animals and plants now, including invertebrates as well for the animals, have the capacities that rationalize the giving us the rights that we have. So what about the idea of turning toward the agents of these kinds of trauma, that say so traumatogenic agents, which of course ranges from the quote unquote collaborator to anyone you want to talk about. If you want to look at some other kind of parallel, very famous studies, whether you're talking about African American, you're talking about the Holocaust, you're talking about blah, blah, blah. Have you any thoughts about that?
So do you mean like turning towards them through the lens of transspecies psychology, trying to understand the intrapsychic forces at play in motivations in their behaviors?
In other words, understanding them and approaching them as victims of trauma, or we'll say we don't want to use the victim word, just say the recipients of trauma. The reason I say that is because trauma is foundational, as you described, relational. It takes two to tango. And oftentimes in the course of trauma history or trauma studies, there has been a tendency, which is great, to focus on the quote unquote recipient / victim.
Right.
However, there really has not been a lot of attention on the underlying mechanism, which points to the agents of trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so hugely important. And that definitely wasn't addressed in this dissertation, but actually in both.
It's not a criticism of that. I've just thought about it personally, if that has occurred to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually both in the first and third article, I started them out by including slaughterhouse workers. Sorry. Turn off my notifications. Sorry about that. So I actually started off by including slaughterhouse workers in as agents who are also considered both perpetrators and victims of this kind of traumatogenic societal framework. And I think that Alka actually mentioned this, and she asked, are slaughterhouse workers among those who are muted in this project of co-muting and sort of being these kind of forced perpetrators of violence? They also, I mean, there's a lot of in the literature about the type of trauma that they experience, and the massive trauma that happens among slaughterhouse workers. But not just the people on the ground, right? There's certainly trauma at so many different levels, and I think that would be like a hugely valuable area of research. Right?
So the idea is to sort of take a model from more iconic cases such as the Holocaust, or systemic types of genocide that have been perpetuated elsewhere, including here, and to look at that. So we're looking at collusion, collaborator, the whole spectrum, understanding that also as a system of trauma. In other words, so it's a depolarization of the bad guy, good guy, that kind of thing. And I think that that's an important point, because it does really tends, if you take that kind of view, it may help sort of de-vilify, demarginalize animal activists and their own sort of perpetuation of the abuse. So it's like the abuse cycles. So just an idea in terms of your.
Yeah, no, and that's hugely important to me to kind of undo some of this splitting between like, you know, that I know sometimes animal activists can find them really entrenched in, you know, good versus evil, right? And there can be feel a huge divide that we have nothing to do with the people on the other side. But I agree, and I think that, you know, some of what I was trying to hint at in that third paper was that some of the enormous defenses that people who kind of systems and peoples who don't want to think about it, don't want to hear about it, want to kind of disenfranchise animal activists, those defenses actually stem from something within them that is deeply traumatized by that information and that is kind of holding that collective trauma. But I think that would be great to say more explicitly.
So it's more of a systemic thing, which I do think relates to the sort of systemic trauma, and in my opinion, that is ongoing right now with the last year of various things like COVID and the political mayhem and things like that, that there really is a system of trauma. And I think that's an important kind of view because it essentially helps de-vilify and move away from targeting in that way. So my last question, which I have millions for you, but we'll save. Now you went to a conference and presented on some of this material, you know, and that if you could make a few comments on what you learned about that, that's part A, and what that experience was among environmentalists and people who were also very quote unquote, very pro nature, what your surprises were. And then part B is how has this work changed you? Okay. I'm doing this in two parts so I can just say I have a last question.
Okay, sure. So yeah, that conference was a powerful experience to kind of get to share, you know, to both to speak about and share a workshop on the trans species psyche, and to help people kind of through some experiential exercises find ways to connect more deeply with the sort of dissociated ways that they connect with animals and what that says about their relationships with themselves. And so I think what I found there, you know, wasn't totally surprising, but it was also promising. I found that in speaking for animals in a place where, you know, animals and individuals were kind of largely omitted, there was actually a lot of support. It was almost like it's almost like, I mean, there was one particular experience that I'll share, maybe is partly what you're thinking about, where somebody in the audience asked, because
Sara, why don't you just tell real quickly what the purpose or what the name of the conference was?
Yeah, the conference was called Reciprocal Healing. Gosh, it was a while ago. Reciprocal Healing, and it had, I don't remember what came after the colon, but it had to do with the reciprocal healing that could happen between nature and human beings. And it was hosted by the Eco-Psychology Journal and by the
Natural History Museum.
Thank you, Natural History Institute. And so someone had given a presentation about how paying attention to the natural world was an act of love. And someone raised their hand and said, well, can like hunting and killing a deer and bringing it home for dinner be an act of love too? And he's like, absolutely. Yes, of course. And so I was like, oh God, okay, I know I got to say something now. And so I raised my hand and I said something like, you know, I think that it might be helpful for us to kind of pause before we answer questions like that and really take a moment to think, like, that's an act of love for whom and to whom? And if we're going, and the importance of decentering ourselves with respect to animals. And that after I got a lot of applause after making that comment, and like almost like 30 people came up to me afterwards, thanking me for making that comment, which I was shocked because no one in the entire conference had said anything really about animals as individuals. It's just not often, you know, as you know, spoken of in certain ecological circles. So that gave me a lot of hope. that it seemed like there was almost like an unexpressed need there. So, okay. Part 2 of your question, how has this work changed me? My gosh. I feel like this work has been working. It's kind of like in the vein of Romanician, where the research itself kind of wants to say something through you, where the research itself works on you. I feel like this work has been working on me for many years, actually. And so in some ways, carrying out and writing this research, I think has helped me grieve to some extent, has sort of brought me deeper into the embodied portions of my own psyche that really feel deeply with animals. I feel like it's almost like carved something out where there's more openness to feeling the grief that I feel when I think about what's happening to animals. And it's allowed me to even like watch really graphic videos that in the past, like I was just the kind of person I would never watch anything like that. Watch videos and find the space within me to feel the pain of what's happening with animals. Like I think it's increased my capacity and my empathy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Gay.
Okay, do you have questions for Sara?
Absolutely. First, I want to start, Sara, by saying I thought you did a beautiful job with your presentation. It was just so beautifully held. And I was impressed with how you did that without PowerPoints, like very clearly laid out each chapter, as well as your foundations and conclusions. I also really liked the revisions that you made, particularly the in-depth revision to the co-muting.
Mm-hmm.
So I have several questions. I will let's just see how much time we have. But my first question has to do with primarily with your chapter on the project of co-muting. And it seemed that you were talking about like humans vis-a-vis animals, but I didn't see a lot of delineation among who is doing the co-muting, right? As if all humans are both perpetrators and recipients of the muting, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the different levels of experience around, those who've designed the factory farms, those who are complicit through consumption versus like the activists. Like, are we all equally co-muted, and are we all equally responsible for the act of muting others?
Mm. Okay, great question. I think you said something at the beginning that was sort of a question, but I kind of agreed with it as a statement. I think you said we're all perpetrators and recipients of the co-muting. And I think to some extent that feels true to me. But that being said, I do think that that people who attempt to give voice to animal suffering, who go into those types of environments and bear witness, and then bring, like, I think I call them messengers of the co-muted or messengers of the muted, are probably are in some ways like I think maybe relating it to the third article, where I spoke about animal activists being kind of carriers, the carrier group who is bringing this collective trauma into the light. I think that I would view them more as actors who are trying to mend and heal this divide than as complicit as those who kind of actively dissociate, actively silence, actively create discourse that's meant to, reduce empathy towards non-human animals. At the same time, I don't think that, I think that they suffer from kind of commuting in a different way. I think that animal activists can go down a path where, it just in speaking to many of them, where they actually are completely dissociated from their bodies and their affect, where they're actually acting almost just like from a mindless kind of drive that becomes where they become divorced of the reality. I do think that that's because they're more recipients of this muting. But so I don't think there's like a clear line, between each category, like who's muted and who's not. I think we all do a little bit of both, right? But I certainly think there are degrees with respect to it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that my position on that, it's that there's a need for not so much a vilification, but for clarity around accountability.
Right.
Like the systems and the peoples that hold the system in place versus create the system versus hold it in place versus
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the first question was about differences among humans, and my second is around differences among animals, because somehow we love to hear animals when they're cute, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they are, I mean, people watch cat videos all day long. People talk about their cats. They talk about their dogs. They talk about cute polar bears and panda bears.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could speak to something of your understanding of sort of that level of splitting within the human psyche, where we're able to put dote on some animals and would on some humans, right? And then how this complete neglect or just unawareness of other
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that I spoke about that in an earlier iteration of my dissertation. It didn't make it to the final cut. I think that in some ways, we long for connection. I'm going to say two different kind of maybe divergent things. I think we long for connection with animals, and we actually long for ways to connect with them and with that part of ourselves through relationship, and that pets are sort of like societally designated safe receptacles for that longing for connection. On the other hand, that kind of splitting animals into categories and even looking at cute animal videos could be said to be another form of objectification of animals, and a way of dividing up animals in terms of what they can do for us, right? And how they can serve us. And I think there's a book about I don't remember what it is. It's something about pet ownership and condescension, or not that I'm anti-pet having pets, but that can certainly, if depending on what our attitude is towards that animal, we can certainly watch cute cat videos and have that kind of eye towards them that enacts that same kind of silencing that we enact upon animals who we don't wish to see, right? It's all sort of sorted and designated by us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would also offer that I think for many people, their companion animals actually allow them to feel into the transverbal parts of themselves.
Right. Absolutely.
It can be part of helping the unmuting. But there needs to be some awareness of how those companion animals are no different, really.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to say that I think that everybody who has a pet is involved in some kind of condescending relationship. I know that probably most people who have pets actually really experience that, their companion's subjectivity, and are in a beautiful intersubjective relationship.
Thank you. And then I think the last point was more of just a suggestion for future work rather than a question as much, because I appreciate that you're really looking at the psychoanalytic literature and some of the depth psychology literature. And I learned a lot from that because my own work is more in the socio-political analysis of these issues. At the same time, it does seem to me that that the issue of the feminine maybe be something you need to explore more as you move further with this work, because when we think about, for instance, the shadow, right, and what's been suppressed within us, it's also the feminine within both men and women, right? And most animal activists historically have been women, right? And have been considered hysterical or over emotional, or all of those ways that women are put down for their femininity.
Yeah.
And then the other piece is also around, like when I teach around veganism and animals, one of the most resistance I get is from groups of peoples of color, often Black and Indigenous folks, who have been rendered animal-like by colonialism and by genocide and by slavery. And so the response is always like, how do you expect me to care about non-human animals when I'm still struggling, when my community is still struggling to be seen as fully human? And so it seems to me that there is kind of a need for a sort of a different framing or discourse at times when we talk about intrahuman violence, right? Because you talk about the way, I think this is a quote from your work, the ways in which humans hold animals as other, thereby condoning violence, are the same ways that humans hold portions of themselves as other. I would say it's the way that some humans have held other humans as other.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
So
I totally agree.
it's not a critique, and it's not even a question, but it's just maybe a suggestion for something to look further into as you go forward with your work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's vital. I mean, I think that the same mechanisms are at play, right? And those that kind of divide up human and animal and divide up humans from other humans, it's the same. If we can step back, we can see it's the same overarching mechanism, but it's hard to see when you're in the midst of that struggle.
Right. Well, I would say if we hadn't been able to do it to animals, we never would have been able to do it to other humans. Some wouldn't be able to do it to others because that template wouldn't have been there, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
So I'm complete.
Okay. Thank you, Alka.
Sara, I have one question for you. And before I ask, I just want to mention just a few of the many things that I appreciate about your work. And, you know, starting with the clarity of this presentation, it was just great to hear you go through and talk about what led you to the study and why it's important to you. And the really deep questions that you asked along the way, deep, important questions. How you shared some of your struggles. And I think you and I share a weariness with those kinds of psychology that make it all about us. That anthropocentric, you know, my animal, and as though animals were just totems or whatever, you know, inner totems. And so I appreciate your way of holding psychology. In maybe a way of saying it is that you're holding it in an extroverted way, as well as the usual introverted move from the inside, from the outside in, you know. So I like that very much too. And I was reminded too of something Jung said in both the Black and Red books, which are basically his journals. And when reading your dissertation and also during the presentation, where at one point he's confronted by, in his imagination, he did a lot of work with active imagination and visionary experience. And at one point when figures that I think are his ancestors, he never says, but it seems like that's who they were. They basically come to him and they say, why are we so unhappy? What did we do wrong when we were alive? And he says, you forgot your animal. And it's clear from the context that he doesn't just mean the inner animal, you know. So I really appreciate how your work does all those things, and it fills such an important gap in not just knowledge, but empathy. So my question is, I'm imagining somebody maybe seeing a presentation that you've given, or, you know, a video, or being at a conference or what have you, and they come up to you and they say something along the lines of, you know, I was in such denial about all this pain, and now everywhere I turn, I see the misery. I see trucks full of meat. I see the clothes that I wear, and it's all I can now think about. I'm just being bombarded with empathic suffering, and it's traumatizing me, you know. And this is somebody who hasn't really been an animal activist, but who all of a sudden their defenses collapse and they get what's really happening with all this, you know. So they're really raw, they're in a lot of pain. And so what my question is based on your work, what if they're looking for some sort of guidance from you, what would you offer them?
That's a great question. Well, I think that it's important when doing this work to kind of almost like shuttle between the external, like seeing all the suffering out there, and the internal. right? And so I think that if someone is, kind of becoming consistently traumatized in everything they see, focused outwardly about everything that's happening in the world, perhaps it means it's time for them to then bring the attention inside and to really do maybe some somatic work, some depth work around what is this stirring inside of me? What part of me feels scared and unsafe? What part of me is crying alongside the animals that I hear crying everywhere? So to bring that into the interpsychic framework, because I think if we stay too long, it's just like what you were mentioning around the extroverted work. I think if we stay too long in either dimension without kind of traveling back and forth, then there's a kind of paralysis that happens. I'll also say that I think in some sense that, this person is actually coming into a realistic apprehension of what it's like to live in a traumatogenic societal framework. In some sense, kind of like what animal activists suffer, right? When they come out of, seeing what they see on these factory farms, they kind of are experiencing what you just described. Like they see it everywhere. They like see someone like eating a sandwich. Is there turkey in there? They can't walk down the street. And in some ways, you might say that traumatic apprehension is a more realistic one. In that sense, we'd say, well, we got to change take action, right? We have to actually maybe channel some of that into action to change the social context in which you're living and seek support, right? Seek social support. So I think that's what I would say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I sometimes when the discussion is in a somewhat different arena, and I'm thinking of eco-anxiety and climate change, there's a process people go through sometimes where they just finally realize how bad it really is and they decompensate. And there's an attitude on the part of activists sometimes that, well, that's just part of the ride. You just have to bear up and, and I think that ignores really important things about human nature and how defenses work. Right. So I appreciate that part of your work too, that you take account of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. It's a great question.
So I don't have any further questions. So at this point, I'd like to suggest a couple of things. One is that the committee call me on my cell phone so that we can converse a little bit. And that that the committee mute yourselves and turn off your video while we're doing it. And then the other thing I'd like to do is invite everybody who's here to ask Sara questions and have some discussion while we confer. And we will be back shortly. So,
Greg, could you resend your phone number, please?
I will.
Thank you.
Did you get that?
Let me check.
I sent it through the chat there. I can also call
it. Chat. Okay, sorry. I didn't check chat.
You got it?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So okay. We will return shortly.
Thanks.
Hey, Sara, enjoyed your talk very much. This is Leslie, Gabe's
Leslie.
aunt.
I know.
Hi, Sara. Congratulations. I'm sure they're going to talk about you and make you suffer for a few minutes.
Okay.
And hopefully come back and call you Dr. Granovetter. But I have a question. And I listened to it intently, and I'm a university professor, and I'm on the applied side. So what's the application of your work? Like if somebody were to say to you, okay, now what can you do with it?
Well, I mean, I think that there's more research probably needs to be done before we get to applications, but I think that ultimately my hope is that it can be applied to kind of activist messaging. I think the thing that I most am interested in is like how can we make it so that animal activism doesn't feel like it's just like opposed to the rest of society, right? That doesn't feel like it's just sort of such a turnoff, and it doesn't sort of set one group of people completely against one another, but it can kind of be somehow framed in such a way that takes into account the sort of normal defenses people have around the topic, and can create bridges instead of walls, right? So I think that's the application that I think is most important. And then another is just like, I think just helping animal activists work through some of their like significant trauma so that then they can come through and be more effective advocates, right? Because sometimes when activists are just really like really deep in their trauma, they don't always come through as very effective spokespeople, and they can tend to alienate people. So I think that some of this inner work is important for sort of integrating activists into society. So
I like that. Have you ever watched this TV series called Alone?
no.
I hadn't either, but John's daughter turned us onto it. And I started on season 7 and worked backwards down to season 1. And it's about these, what do they call it? They're like trained survivalists that are put in the wilderness, and they're each on their own. And they have to survive. And the one who survives the longest gets $500,000, or in the last season, $1 million.
Okay.
And the last two seasons took place in the Arctic. And what I was really impressed with was they were starving. You could tap out when you just couldn't handle it anymore, and they would come rescue you within, looked like minutes, but it was probably hours. And then you were out of it, though. You were sort of quitting the season, and the last one standing got the money at the end. And most of them tapped out when they were so starving, they couldn't do anything more because they couldn't find food. But when they did find food and they had to kill a squirrel or a rabbit or a fish, almost every time they talked to the animal and said, "I'm really sorry I'm doing this. I'm really sorry I have to do this, buddy, but I have to eat. I'm starving." And I thought, I don't know, I was impressed by the message. They were each time. It happened in every series, and each time they killed an animal.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's certainly more of a relational approach.
Just an aside.
Yeah, that's very different from how it usually happens, isn't it, in our system?
Yeah, no, I thought it was kind of cool. It's a cool series. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize the question time.
All right. Thanks, Leslie.
It's a nice presentation.
Thank you.
Come on, somebody else asked her question.
It's okay. Oh,
We have a question.
okay.
Go ahead, Dad.
I'm Gary.
Hi, Gary.
Sara, wonderful. Really, I enjoyed it, even though I probably heard 3/4 of it amidst Junie's interference. But in regard to the question that you asked at that conference, and in regard to what Leslie just mentioned, I would think that in some respect, there would be an amplification to the species. Is let's say that you're a deer hunter. You kill the deer, and upon dismembering it, you do, as these people in the wilderness that Leslie describes, you pay homage to the species. And in some respects, it seems like that elevates the species in regard to not only yourself, not only to the species, but in regard to other people, that it might embrace such a process. What's your thought?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that, I have mixed feelings about that topic. And, I think I sort of deliberately, like, even in that conference, I sort of abstained from answering the question, like, do I think it's okay to like hunt animals for food, or is it not okay? It just feels like almost like an impossible question to answer for me personally. But I think that, one of the things that kind of sets animal activism apart from maybe more of that species level consciousness or the ecological consciousness is the consideration of the individual. And so, like, for instance, if you were to think about that with respect to human beings, like, I went, if you were to say that, I went to this island and I killed one of the people on that island, and then I gave thanks to the whole tribe or the whole, group of people, like, would that elevate them? I think the answer would usually be no, right? Because probably that individual would not chosen to have been killed. That being said, I don't, possess the answer to like the mystery of life and whether, whether there is like, even something in the individual that senses that, senses like kind of like the food chain and senses their part in it. Maybe there is. I can't speak to that, but I do think that, I think that sometimes that conclusion is sort of jumped to like a little too quickly. Well, if we honor the animal, then it's okay. And then and I guess the question is, okay, for whom? Is it really okay? Is it really honoring the species? Is it really honoring the animal? Or is it for us to feel better about what we've done? So those are like the questions that I would have around that without having any one clear, answer.
Mhm. Thanks.
I mean, if you're starving
Yeah.
and you're a human,
Mhm.
and it's eat or be eaten. If you don't eat the animal, a different animal is going to come along and eat you. It's sort of like the survival of the fittest, and
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that, and it's sort of this paper deliberately like puts us in like the Western industrial paradigm where, we're not really in that context these days. But for sure, I think that what I'm saying probably wouldn't apply like in that type of context where it actually is a matter of survival. But that's the case for few of us these days, right? Most of us can survive very well on like a plant-based diet. Not everyone, but it's arguably.
I find people that fish don't treat almost fishing like walking down the street. Seems like a very different thing than someone who goes out hunting, but for some it may be very equal.
Yeah, maybe so.
We fish. We don't kill the fish, but I'm under no illusion that I didn't make that fish's day by catching it on my hook and then releasing it. I know I did not make that fish happy.
A good place to start with that awareness.
But it's so damn much fun. But sometimes we eat it.
It's okay, we're going.
Hey, Gabe.
Well, we are back.
I'm
and,
muting. Sorry.
I'm very happy to be able to say that the opinion of the committee is unanimous that, Sara, you have passed your dissertation defense. And I get to have the honor of being the first to call you Dr. Granovetter. So
Yay.
congratulations.
Wonderful.
you.
Congratulations.
Excellent work.
Thank you so much.
And I also have to point out that for the rest of your life and career, you'll be able to say that you defended your dissertation on International Women's Day.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Gabe pointed that out. That's awesome.
Excellent work.
And on the internet.
Yep. There's a few things we'd like you to go ahead and just either be aware of or add, but they're extremely minor.
Bye.
We'll be in touch with you offline about that.
Okay.
But for now, the last assignment I'll give you is that you have to go celebrate. So with your family. So.
Okay, I will. Thank you so much, everyone.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Get used to the doctor part.
All right.
Learned
I will.
Congratulations, doctor.
Thank
Yep.
you. Thank
Love
you so
you.
much for being here, everyone. Gay, Alka, and Craig, thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank
take
you.
care.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Be
Have
safe.
gratitude. Take care, Sara.
Bye.